Morning. Thanks all very much for having me. My name is Nathaniel Gleicher, and I am the head of security policy at Facebook. My team coordinates our work across the company to track and counter adversarial threats, determined actors that are looking to either manipulate our platforms, target users across the internet, or cause other types of harm online. My background, as he mentioned, I spent some time as a security engineer. I was then a cybercrime investigator, worked in government on the policy side, and now in the private sector. So I've been in the security world for quite some time from different directions. And one of the things you hear consistently in any security conversation, I feel like, perhaps one of the most common aphorisms or phrases is that attackers have the advantage online, that the adversary has an advantage. And it's certainly true that when a threat actor can move first, when they have surprise, that gives them a first mover advantage. But what I want to talk about today is the other side of the coin, which is the advantage that defenders have. Because if attackers have a first mover advantage, then defenders, all of us here in this room, the partners we work with, we have a networked advantage that builds over time. Let me explain what I mean by that. Our team tracks threats around the world, a wide range of threats. This might be an influence operation that a foreign government is using to try to manipulate an election. It might be a coordinated campaign to surveil or monitor the critics of a regime or a government. It might be a spam or a sort of financially motivated effort to scam people to try to steal money. For all of these, we're seeing threat actors try to come up with new techniques. But there are some specific things that I think all of us already do and can do together to contain these. For a little bit of context, this map is a map of all of the influence operations that our teams have identified, removed, shared information about, and then disclosed publicly over the past few years. There are about 200 or close to 200 up here. They originate in more than 50 countries, more than a dozen languages. They've targeted people around the world. When you look at this, you see a pretty good number of dots from different places. And you can see that there's not just a distribution, but it's a whole range of targeting, interesting, just floating in the sky as if there was a country there. But it's not just influence operations. I want to talk about 5 different types of threats that we track and think about. First, overt influence operations, efforts to manipulate public debate in your own name. Think about state media. Second, covert influence operations, efforts to hide your identity and then use that anonymity to manipulate public discussion. Third, espionage, or what you might call cyber espionage, surveillance, hacking into compromising and taking over accounts, trying to monitor regime critics or targets. Fourth, scams and clickbait. We talk a lot about government threats, but I think everyone in this room knows one of the most determined adversaries any of us face are scammers. And then last, what I would call emerging harms, which is an evolving threat space where groups of real people come together to try to drive other types of harm online. It might be to harass individuals. It might be to brigade or silence them. It might be to target DDoS attacks or other types of threats. These are each different types of threats, but there are common patterns behind them. And what I wanted to do is to talk about 2 things. First, some of the adversarial trends that we've seen around the world in recent years, ways that the adversaries are moving and continuing to move and exploiting their advantage. And then second, what we can do as defenders to counter that. So to start with adversarial trends, I want to talk about 4 ways in which we're seeing threat actors adapt and evolve, particularly over the period of the pandemic. First, blurring the lines between authentic speech and manipulation. One of the things you'll note as I talk about these is I'm talking about both disinformation and influence threats, and then hacking and cybersecurity threats. If you think about an influence operation back in 2016, it was actually somewhat straightforward. You build a large network of fake accounts, and you use them to amplify a false narrative. Today, those techniques don't work as well anymore. And they don't work that well because defenders around the world, in government, in industry, in civil society, have gotten better and better at catching those operations. And so we're seeing threat actors evolve their techniques and try to use different techniques. In particular, they are continually trying to blur the line between legitimate speech and manipulation, and to make it harder and harder for defenders to tackle these threats. As I go through each of these trends, I'm going to reference some of the cases and operations that our teams have removed around the world to give some context. So let me give you a couple of examples. First of these is an operation from the end of last year that originated in China and was designed to undermine trust in COVID vaccines and reasonable COVID health mitigations. It was centered around a false identity, a fake scientist, supposedly based in Switzerland, that didn't exist, that was calling out and criticizing a number of these healthcare approaches. Now that sounds like an influence operation, but the amplification for it, the way that they tried to get everyone to pay attention to it, wasn't fake accounts, it wasn't bots. It was real people, in particular, a large number of individuals that worked with or were associated with Chinese state entities that were amplifying this message. And so you see a combination of a false narrative, a false identity, and real people amplifying the story, which raises a question for defenders: what's real and what's not? Where do you draw the line, and how do you enforce against this? The second example here is something we've seen increasingly when you think about crises around the world. Whether you think about the trucker convoy in the United States or the invasion of Ukraine and the surrounding events, we know that people care deeply about these issues and engage about them online. And unfortunately, one of the things we've seen is that scammers, unsurprisingly, know this too. And they will create fake communities to bring in people who care about these issues. It might be a group on Facebook, it might be a hashtag on another social media platform, and they'll gather real people together, and those people will begin discussing and caring about what's happening. There's a real legitimate debate happening. But the scammers will use that community they've created to target those people for financial fraud, for scams and tricks, other types of things. And so now you have real, legitimate public debate among real people happening in a space created by an adversary and being used to target those innocent people. So where do you draw the line? Do you take that conversation down, even though it's a real debate? How do you protect the innocent people? It's a great example of the type of innovation we see from these adversaries. They're trying to come up with new techniques that make life harder and harder for defenders. Second trend, the rise of threat actors for hire. On the cybersecurity side, for years, we have seen specialization within the criminal world. Threat actors that build a criminal skill and then offer it for sale. We're seeing this more and more broadly from adversaries online. So what I mean by that is a threat actor might have a legitimate business, and on the side, they sell, let's call it slightly less legitimate services to slightly less legitimate people. I'll give you a couple of examples and talk about what these mean. First, if we think about influence operations and disinformation, we increasingly see PR firms selling disinformation as a service. A particular example here, which came from last year, was when a Russian-based PR firm was looking to undermine trust in COVID vaccines. And they tried to hire influencers, real people, on the internet to talk about how untrustworthy these vaccines were. Our teams and others identified and exposed this operation. But one of the consequences of threat actors for hire is that they can hide the real actor behind the campaign. When our teams investigate, we can figure out who the firm is. It was a PR firm named Faze. They're based in Russia. We might all have hypotheses about who's behind this, about who paid for this service, but no one can prove it. Because if you make the purchase offline, it can be very hard to identify who hired the operator. And so you create a layer of obfuscation. We let threat actors hide themselves. The second example of this is that threat actors for hire proliferate these threats. There are many organizations out there that don't have the skill to run a hacking campaign or run an influence operation, but they have money. And so if you can buy these services, we increasingly see smaller governments, political campaigns, and a wide range of criminal actors availing themselves of services they couldn't have used before. A great example of this, the surveillance for hire industry, which we put out a threat report on, detailing 7 organizations that are effectively cyber mercenaries that sell their services to the highest bidder. makes more and more of these threats available to threat actors. Third example of trends, blending operations. At the beginning, I mentioned those 5 types of threats: overt influence operations, covert influence operations, spam and clickbait, espionage, and emerging harms. It's important to think about the types of threats we face, but threat actors don't limit themselves to one tactic. They have a goal, and they use whatever tactics they can to accomplish it. And increasingly, we see them blending their techniques to cause as much harm and make life as difficult as possible for defenders. One operation that our teams removed is called Ghostwriter, which a number of people in this room, I suspect, have been tracking on your own organizations, and we've worked together with you, and I appreciate all the support and the partnership. This is an organization that has been operating across Eastern Europe in particular, and they identify high-profile individuals, they compromise their accounts, and then they try to use that compromise to push false narratives. For example, since the invasion of Ukraine, we've seen this organization target Ukrainian military officials, attempt to compromise their accounts across a wide range of social media platforms, and then use those accounts to suggest that the Ukrainian military is surrendering. They are combining hacking, compromising accounts, with influence operations. We're seeing this blend. Another good example of this is an operation in Azerbaijan that was primarily domestically focused and was looking to silence critics of the regime and using a wide range of tactics to do this. It might include compromising their accounts, coordinating large communities of accounts and people to silence or criticize people, trying to get their accounts reported to be taken down, and running influence operations. They combine all of these techniques to accomplish their goal. And so as we think about countering them, it's really important to remember they don't limit themselves to one type of threat, right? The threat actors don't just hack into operations or run influence operations. They blend these together to be as effective as possible. And then the last example that I have here is called Diversifying Targets. Increasingly, we see threat actors not just targeting one platform or one environment, but multiple ones. So again, that Ghostwriter operation I mentioned is a great example of this. They operate by first compromising the email of their targets, and then from there, they pivot through all their social media accounts. A consequence of this is that if we, or any of those other defender teams, identify a compromised account, we can lock the account down, but it turns out it's very hard to return control of the account back to the user. Because if their email is compromised, if their devices are compromised, and we give them back control, the threat actors just take it over again. And so this blending and targeting of multiple platforms makes it harder and harder for defenders, because no single team can tackle this alone. We have to partner across industry and civil society to get ahead of these threat actors. And we're seeing them try to attack the spaces between us and make it harder for us to respond quickly. So these are 4 different trends that we're seeing threat actors invest in and exploit. This looks like the attacker advantage everyone hears about. Very specifically, we're seeing them use their first mover advantage. But there are a number of things that defenders can do to make this less effective and to tackle these threats. And the first thing to just say is, as defenders, no single institution or community can tackle the types of threats we see online by themselves. You have to have tech platforms and industry, government, the media, and civil society all working together to tackle these threats. And that's because each of these players brings a different set of skills and tools to the field that make life harder for the threat actors. And I've talked a lot about attacker advantage. I promised to talk about defender advantage, and here's what I mean by that. Attackers have a one-off advantage. They get to move first. If you think about the game of chess, there's a concept called tempo. The white player moves first, and that gives them initiative. The attackers have that advantage. They can exploit it with surprise, and they can make life harder for defenders. But defenders have a network advantage, a systemic advantage. Over time, if we tackle multiple operations and we work across multiple sectors, we can make life harder and harder for the threat actors. Imagine again playing that game of chess. and the white player makes a move, and you see the move that they make. They like the pawn up to king's 2, and you watch their play. And then next time you play them, you can actually change the chessboard and put a river right through the middle of the board to slow them down. You can actually change the environment to make it harder for the threat actors. That is the defender's advantage, and it's incredibly powerful. And I think we undersell ourselves a lot on what we can do here. Let me give you an example of what I mean. We think about this from the concept of adversarial design and the adversarial design cycle. Normally, when you're developing products for your users. And you would hope and expect that the users might come up with new uses, because that probably means a new business line. It probably means new opportunities. How do you design products for adversaries? That is the question of the adversarial design cycle. How do you design products to be resistant to the types of threats we're talking about? We do that in 4 steps that I think are interesting to think about and generally applicable. First, threat ideation. Using strategic foresight to think about what do the new threats look like, how are they changing, and how do we get ahead of them. Second, threat disruption. Tracking and countering threat actors as they develop on the platform. Third, improving your defenses. You can't just tackle the bad actors. You have to change the platform to be more resistant to them. This is that changing the chessboard example that I offered, right? So as a simple example, one of my favorite ones, in 2016, threat actors used advertising to try to influence an election. We built a whole series of defenses to make advertising more resistant to this. In particular, requirements that if you want to run a political ad, you need to prove you're from the country that you're targeting. And we've seen this work because we've seen threat actors try to get around it and fail. My favorite story is a threat actor, Russia-linked threat actor, wanted to run fake ads, couldn't defeat our systems. They hired a criminal group to try to run ads for them, a criminal group based in Nigeria. And that group took the money and never ran the ads. You would think they would have seen that coming. That's exactly the type of constraint you can put on these threat actors. They spend their time trying to defeat your systems instead of running operations. And then you put all this together with partnerships, that point that I mentioned about the entire society working together. Now, one tool that is incredibly effective in this tool belt that we're starting to see more of, but I think it's not that well understood yet, is public disclosure as deterrence. Now, this is something we saw deployed very effectively by a number of Western governments in the lead up to and since the invasion of Ukraine. And threat teams here at Facebook, at Meta, and around the room use this as they disclose operations. But I think it's important to ask what this does and how to use it effectively. Public disclosure, it doesn't stop threat actors from running campaigns. If you think it will, then it won't and you'll be disappointed. What it does is it degrades their effectiveness. Even if they run a campaign, it won't work as well. If you know someone's running an influence operation and they're going to push a particular false narrative, getting the narrative out in advance and saying they're going to do that makes it less effective. If you know that a threat actor is targeting a particular community with phishing or a specific exploit, warning that community so they can protect themselves and know what's coming makes the operation less effective. Each time you do this, you degrade the adversary and you strengthen defenders. If you remember my point about a networked advantage, when you disclose information, you empower all the defenders around society. And yes, when you disclose campaigns, you can deter adversaries. You can make life hard for them. But it's important to understand who the adversary is and how you can do that. For example, for certain criminal actors, if you disclose their operations, that can expose them to criminal liability in their country. For organizations like those threat for hire companies, they often have a legitimate business and an illegitimate business. If you expose their illegitimate business, that puts their legitimate business at risk, and it puts their fundamental business model at risk. It can be a very effective technique. For countries that run operations like this and don't tell anyone, they're probably trying to play themselves off as legitimate players on the world stage. When you expose this, you make it harder and harder for them to pretend that they're above the fray. And for some threat actors, just getting exposed and caught can make them look foolish. Remember, I think it's very important, one of the most impactful effects of the Russian operations that targeted the US election in 2016 is that they made Russian activity look incredibly effective online. And they were able to create this image of themselves as almost invincible online. And they used that. But over the past 4 years, we have seen their operations get caught again and again. We've seen them be disclosed early, before they can reach very many people and before they're that effective. And what that does is it pierces that claim of invincibility. And it shows you that they aren't as powerful as they claim they are. Disclosure can be a deterrent, and it can contain these threat actors. And I think it's a tactic we can use across society. At Meta, we do this through our threat reporting. So we produce a quarterly threat report that discloses all the types of operations that we've been tackling over the past quarter, shares information about them, and then we pair that with specific TTPs and data sharing to governments, to industry, and civil society partners. And the goal here is to contain the threat actors and also to empower defenders around the world. We've seen other teams do the same thing. The teams at Twitter, the teams at Google, the teams at Microsoft use this same technique. And CTA, the Cyber Threat Alliance, has been very effective in this space as well. So this is a really powerful tool. But these principles can apply to each of the communities I mentioned: industry, government, civil society, and media. Let me talk about a couple of the things that different parts of society can use to build this defender's advantage that we've already seen. From a platform perspective, I think that the public disclosure and the data sharing piece is absolutely critical because we see threats that others don't. And getting that information out to the defender community is one of the most important things we can do. But that piece about adversarial design is absolutely critical because increasingly large volumes of the threats we're all tracking happen across major technical platforms. And that means that over time, we can change those platforms to make them more resistant to bad actors. That example of the ads that I mentioned is one of them. Another one, we have automated systems that detect and block fake accounts incredibly quickly. Millions of them every day, many of them within minutes of creation. Now, if you're a determined adversary, you can still create a fake account. We all know that no automated system by itself will stop a nation state or a determined actor. But they're forced to work harder and harder for every inch of gain. And that change empowers everyone. It creates that network effect where the bad guys are forced further and further downhill and the good guys have a stronger and stronger position. Government has an incredibly important role here as well, in a couple of different ways. The first I'll mention is in the context of regulation. I mentioned at the top that we're seeing threat actors use grayer and grayer techniques to try to blur the lines. We're also seeing more and more domestic actors try to manipulate public debate. In situations like this, regulation to define the boundary between impermissible manipulation and legitimate debate is extremely important. The other key area is in deterrence. If we think about those threat for hire actors, governments have an incredibly powerful opportunity to make life hard for them, to limit the ability to indiscriminately sell hacking tools and surveillance tools, and to constrain their ability to make these threats more difficult. Governments also have particular intelligence capabilities. Surprises no one in this room that government intelligence services have specific tools that industry and civil society does not and should not. But that means that they will see threats sometimes that no one else sees. There have been a number of times in the past several years where an early tip from a government has helped us identify and counter a broad threat. And so that type of sharing is extremely valuable. And perhaps most important, it's essential that democracies in particular lead in this space. And the reason I say that is we want democracies to define what constitutes legitimate activity and legitimate public debate online. Because if they don't, there are a bunch of autocratic regimes that are very happy to do it around the world and are already trying to do it. Recent work here in Europe has been incredibly encouraging, and I'm hoping to see more and more of this around the world to define these rules and boundaries. Media and civil society is the last category, and they're also an incredibly important community, and they're important for a couple of different reasons. First, they bring expertise in investigations that cross different platforms. I should note, actually, interestingly, the vendor community also brings this expertise. The ability to investigate not just in one platform or another, but across multiple ones. If we think about threat actors targeting multiple platforms, the most memorable, perhaps, is an operation called Secondary Infection, that was Russia-linked, that our teams identified and a number of teams enforced against, that ultimately existed on more than 300 platforms across the internet. Right? To tackle these very broad operations, you need the ability to look across multiple spaces. Civil society brings a particular expertise there. Also, topical expertise in a country or a region that a platform or an industry team might not have. Also, civil society in particular has a level of legitimacy, a different type of legitimacy. Right now, I know it'll be a big surprise to everyone, but trust in industry and government is not exactly the highest at the moment. And it's very important to have voices in civil society that can validate, that can agree with, and that can hold the other players to account when they need to make sure that industry and government is doing its part to tackle these threats. In all of this, I think there's a particular challenge for civil society and for the media, which is when you talk about these operations, I talked about disclosure as deterrence. You also have to be careful not to play into the hands of the threat actors, not to use too much hyperbole, and to end up making them seem more powerful than they are. There's a careful line to walk here, but it's an extremely powerful and critical one. So I've talked about 4 types of defenders: government, industry, civil society, and media, and a range of different techniques that we see threat actors using. The core thesis of all of this, though, is that on the one hand, we know that adversaries are continuing to innovate. They are continuing to move quickly. And they're exploiting the surprise that they have. Each time they come up with a new technique, they can surprise defenders and try to steal a march on us. And they're doing that across a range of threats. They're increasingly willing to blend their techniques to target multiple operations or multiple platforms, and to do whatever they need to do to surprise defenders. All of that is about the attacker advantage, that one-off advantage that they keep exploiting. But when you look around at defenders, we have a very clear advantage too, and that advantage is networked. It's the fact that there are multiple teams across society. It's the fact that we tackle multiple operations, we see these tactics and techniques, and we can build systems to make them less and less effective over time. And the best outcome of all of this is that the attacker's advantage is fairly consistent. They can always surprise you, but it's always just a surprise, and then you've seen it, and you can defend against it. The defender advantage scales exponentially. Each time a platform increases its systems to make it harder for bad actors, that helps all defenders. Each time a vendor develops a new detection system that can catch these actors more effectively, that makes it better for all defenders. Each time a government passes a regulation or a framework that deters threat actors and makes life harder for them, that makes it better for all defenders and worse for all threat actors. And each time we all, any of us, share information, we build up teams around the defender community to tackle the threats. And so over time, the defender advantage scales much faster than the attacker advantage. And so I often hear these talks about the advantage that attackers have and how impossible it is to climb over. But the honest truth is, I think it's completely in the other direction. And if we go back to this map of dots floating in space that I started with, when you look at it, at first, it just looks like a lot of operations, right? There's a lot of these dots, they're all over the world, there's a lot of threats. But if you look at the bottom of the screen, you will see a track of operations detected and removed by year. And what you're seeing there is that these operations are getting caught more and more as time passes. They're getting caught sooner, and they're getting caught before they can reach the audiences and have the effect that the threat actors want. That is the defender advantage. The biggest difference in influence operations from 2016 to today is that today there are determined teams countering these threats in government, in civil society, in industry, and in media. And they're all working together. And when we do that, we make life harder and harder for the threat actors and easier for defenders. So thank you all for all the work that you're doing. The thesis of Defender Advantage is that everything that all of us does improves defenses for each of us. Unfortunately, I do not have time for questions at the end of this, but I will just say a number of the talks here today have helped me and yesterday think through the challenges we're facing and how we tackle these pieces. I would love to talk further about it, so if anyone has any questions, please come up to me afterwards. There are a few members of our team here that have driven a lot of the threat disruptions and takedowns I described, so we'd be happy to talk further about it. Thank you all very much.